Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Stalinist Labor Coercion During World War II, An Economic Approach by Martin Kragh. I'm not sure how to pronounce this guy's name, but bear with me. Martin Kragh is Deputy Center Director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, and Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Kragh's research interests include Russia's economy and history, but also the political development in Russia and former USSR. Kragh holds a PhD from the Stockholm School of Economics that he earned in 2009 and is associate professor docent at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. Kragh is also a member of the board of Sverker Åström Foundation and a former member of the board of directors of Transparency International Sweden. So here we go. Here's the abstract. Through a study of Soviet legal practices, the article examines the enforcement of coercive laws and their limitations in the Soviet command economy. New archival documents show the scale and scope of Stalin's coercive machinery. Firstly, we must show why labor legislation assumed its specific form, based on an economic analysis of the command economy. Secondly, we identify four specific limits to the efficient enforcement of the legislation: collusion, search cost, administrative congestion, and in absentia convictions. Thirdly, we provide a new input to the discussion on the scale of the Gulag apparatus, showing that certain data need to be treated cautiously. Now to the text. Traditional economic models of the labor market assume to one extent or another that transactions between buyers and sellers are more or less free. Economic history tells us, however, that labor transactions have only rarely taken this form, and that the dominant mode of transactions has been in a coercive employment relationship. There are different theories on why coercive labor relations have grown and declined, and different varieties of, quote, unfree, end quote, labor have been identified. See Brass and Vanderlinde in 1997 and Engerman 1999. As far as the Soviet experience is concerned, research interest on Stalin's Gulag machinery has been quite substantial since the beginning of the, quote, archival revolution, end quote, in the 1990s. Less work has been done, however, on the less repressive, but in fact completely dominant civilian labor transactions that existed in Soviet industry and construction. There's a footnote here that said, I would like to thank Mark Harrison. I have a piece by maybe more than one piece by Mark Harrison on this channel. Ojan Zuberg, Hakan Lindgren, Hans Ziergen, Anu Mai Kuhl, Anders Ugren, and Donald Filzer. Donald Filzer has pieces on this channel. And the anonymous referees for comment. All the usual disclaimers apply. Where am I? Coercion was the governing mechanism in the Soviet command economy. But coercion could be applied by the regime in varying degrees and thus influence the welfare of the workers. Coercion was used to punish economic non-compliance, while repression was used to punish political non-compliance. Coercion was used to punish economic non-compliance, while repression was used to punish political non-compliance. Whereas workers in a free market can abstain from employment and effort, obviously under the threat of unemployment and other possible sanctions, coercion implies that the workers are forced to accept employment they would otherwise reject. Previous analysis has focused primarily on the use of repression to increase compliance, or in other words, quote, loyalty, end quote. And various restraints have been assumed to be unimportant for the analysis. Although substantial analytic improvements were made in the analysis of Stalinist repression by Paul Gregory in 2009 in his study of the NKVD, less emphasis has been put on the limits that conditioned the implementation and enforcement of coercive practices under Stalin. I should mention that the reason I'm reading this is because it was the reader was Kragh was mentioned has a blurb on the back of Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Paul Gregory, this is from the Hoover Institution. Paul Gregory is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is Cullen Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics at the University of Houston, a research fellow at the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin, and Emeritus Chair of the International Advisory Board of the Kiev School of Economics. Gregory has held visiting teaching appointments at Moscow State University and the Free University of Berlin. Gregory was the director of the Russian Petroleum Legislation Project of the University of Houston Law Center from 1992 to 1997 and has written broadly on Russian energy. The holder of a PhD in economics from Harvard University, Paul Gregory is the author or co-author of 12 books and more than 100 articles on economic history, the Soviet economy, transition economies, comparative economics, and economic demography. Gregory's most recent books are Women of the Gulag, Portraits of Five Remarkable Lives, published with the Hoover Institution Press, 2013. Politics, Murder, and Love in Stalin's Kremlin, the story of Nikolai Bukharin and Anna Larina, published with Hoover Institution Press, 2010. Lenin's Brain and Other Tales from the Secret Soviet Archives, published with Hoover Institution Press, 2008. Terror by Quota, Yale, 2009. And The Political Economy of Stalinism, with Cambridge, 2004, for which he received the Hewitt Prize, awarded to works on the political economy of Russia, Eurasia, or Eastern Europe. Paul Gregory co-edited the lost transcripts of the Politburo, published with Yale in 2008. Paul Gregory's archival work is summarized in Allocation Under Dictatorship, Research in Stalin's Archive. As a producer, Gregory worked with director Mariana Yarovskaya on the documentary film Women of the Gulag, which was shortlisted for the 2019 Academy Awards. Back to the text. This article analyzed the functioning of Stalin's labor edicts implemented in 1940 and 1941, some of which were on the statutes until 1956. Because of their far-reaching importance, they constitute an appropriate case study of coercive practices under Stalin. On the brink of war, the dictator criminalized absenteeism from work and job changing without the management's consent. During the war years, between 1 and 2 million sentences a year were passed in accordance with these edicts, an exceptionally high rate of penalization. We provide a novel interpretation of these edicts from an economic point of view, arguing that Stalin may be fruitfully regarded as a sufficiently, quote, rational dictator, end quote, whose actions can be understood as responding to perceived external and internal challenges. In broad terms, coercion was applied in order to improve effort, as the edicts made non-compliance increasingly costly and reallocated rent from the workers to the regime. However, as this article will show, the sentences imposed are more apparent than real, as enforcement was also costly and monitoring was weak. Building on sources from the Russian state archives, the article sets out to answer 3 related questions. Footnote. This article draws on material from the Russian State Archive of the Economy, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History, and the Russian State Archive of Contemporary History. End footnote. First, why did the legislation on labor assume the specific form it did under Stalin? Second, how is the legislation enforced? Third, what were the limits to its enforcement? Special emphasis is put on the edict on, quote, desertion, end quote, from war industry, implemented in late 1941. The article is structured as follows. The first section provides a short historical background. The second section analyzes the implementation of labor laws under Stalin. The third and last section provides new information on the edict on desertion from war industry and shows how the edict was enforced in practice under conditions of total war. New section. Background. The Bolsheviks had an archaic view on economic efficiency and a purely instrumental view on law. Edicts were decided and formulated by members of the Politburo and usually published as law by the Supreme Soviet on the same or the following day. If, as was often the case, it was not decided, the edicts should be kept secret. The Edict on Labor, issued on the 26th of June, 1940, was not the first of its kind, but it was the first which made absenteeism, as well as job changing without management's consent, a criminal offense. In practice, this meant that leaving one's job without the sanction of management or other valid reason earned a penalty from 2 to 4 months in prison, but not in a labor camp, and any tardiness within the working day of more than 20 minutes was punishable by up to 6 months of coercive labor with reduced pay of up to 25% without deprivation of freedom. Draconian as this edict may seem, suspects were at least tried in the civilian people's courts. Significantly less research has been carried out on the edict of the 26th of December 1941, which made workers in war industry subject to trial in an NKVD military tribunal for desertion, punishable by up to 8 years of, quote, deprivation of freedom, end quote, in a labor camp. The edict covered major sectors of the economy, from ferrous metallurgy to the textile industry. The concept of, quote, war industry, end quote, was also expanded during the war, so that over time the potential pool of workers covered by the edict was also changed. Subject to this edict were mobilized workers who had either abandoned their place of work, the, quote, labor front, end quote, or were considered, quote, persistent absentees, end quote. In April and May 1943, a specific amendment introduced a similar procedure in the railways and water transport, with sentences from 3 to 10 years in a labor camp. Did I say footnote? I said there was a thing that I thought there was a footnote, but there isn't a footnote. Or there wasn't a footnote with information. So this is the text. There were different agents and interest groups whose internal relationship should be explained. At the highest level, members of the Politburo introduced planned goals and all relevant legislation. The Politburo, and primarily its undisputed leader, Joseph Stalin, was the principal decision maker. The most relevant agents in this story were the procuracy, the police, the NKVD, and factory managers. The procuracy was I was trying to see if there was anything for procuracy in the Soviet Union, but I couldn't find anything. The procuracy was responsible for instituting proceedings after having received the relevant material from factory managers. It was the task of the militia to institute a search for workers suspected of desertion, and they in turn also relied on information provided by the managers. As regards the special edict on desertion, edict of the 26th of December 1941, the procuracy was not expected to bring the cases for trial in a civilian court, people's court, but to a military tribunal under the authority of the NKVD. Administrative procedures were modified over time, but this fundamental structure of command remained intact throughout the war. And there's a table here. The table is titled Soviet Labor Edicts and Their Sentences, 1940 to 1956. Edict of the 26th of June, 1940, quote, willful departure, end quote, 2 to 4 months in prison. Edict of the 26th of December, 1941, quote, desertion, end quote, 5 to 8 years in labor camp for workers in war industry, abrogated in May 1948. Article 193 of Criminal Code, Edicts of April and May 1943, 3 to 10 years in labor camp for transport employees, abrogated in March 1948. Absenteeism under the Edict of 26 of June 1940, up to 6 months coercive labor at enterprise with 25% wage deduction, gradual relaxation, and prosecution after 1951. So that's the table. New section. The evolution of Stalin's labor legislation. Soviet leaders experimented with a series of different measures to suppress labor market activity in the 1930s. Previous research, Schwartz 1953, Conquest 1967, Filtzer 1986, has chronicled the evolution of Soviet labor legislation under Stalin. It has been shown how enforcement of coercive labor legislation was arbitrary, since managers and workers found common cause in colluding in order to fulfill planned targets and avoid sanctions. For such reasons, the edicts of the 15th of November 1932 and the 28th of December 1938, targeting absenteeism but not labor turnover, remained virtually toothless. Recent work has also provided more detailed accounts of the introduction of the passport system for the cities, see Kessler 2001, and of the way housing was allocated in accordance with observed compliance with work norms, see Merovich 2008. The background is important in order to comprehend the subsequent tightening of labor coercion in 1940 and 1941. We do not know much about the discussions which preceded the tightening, but the Edict of the 26th of June 1940 was implemented after a Politburo decision only 1 day earlier. Footnote. The document, dated 25th of June 1940, contained the Politburo decision on the implementation of an edict making absenteeism and job changing without management's consent criminal offenses. End footnote. From that point on, tardiness by more than 20 minutes and job changing without management's consent became criminal offenses. What was the rationale for invoking such strict labor regulations? Previous research has given different explanations to this question, one of which takes fully into account the known restraints posed by the functioning of a command economy. We summarize the different explanations under 3 separate headings: the outbreak of the war, historical experience, and the cost of absenteeism and unauthorized labor turnover. New section. The outbreak of the war. The most common argument explains the edict with reference to the outbreak of World War II. Timing, in other words, can explain why the coercion of labor was increased. See, for instance, Mitrofanov Fanova, 1971, Volkov, 1974, and Fitzpatrick, 1994. In the light of the war threat posed by Germany following the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 and the formal surrender of France to Hitler on the 25th of June 1940, it is possible to regard the new labor legislation as part of a general mobilization in preparation for war. However, until the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was still official policy, and Soviet citizens could hardly be told there was any risk of an imminent German attack. As noted by Nova, I think it's Alec Nova, and maybe it's Nove, but for some reason I feel like it's Nova, Nove, 1992, the edict was therefore never presented as part of war preparations when it was officially published. Footnote. Pravda, 27th of June 1940, end footnote. The explanation with reference to timing is plausible since coercion should be expected to increase under conditions of strain, such as external threat, but the circumstances alone cannot explain why coercion assumed the specific form it did. For example, why did the legislation primarily target workers and not enterprise managers, a group Stalin suspected of poor loyalty as much as any other? And what was the rationale for fusing the seemingly discordant aspects of job changing and absenteeism in one piece of legislation? New section, Historical Experience. A second and related explanation can be traced from the experience of World War I, a period when many European nations implemented strict labor legislation. See Hardak, 1973. It was also well known that there had been continuously large efficiency losses in the Russian economy throughout the period of the Civil War, 1918 to 1921, see Polyak, 1923, pages 13 to 15. The leadership was thus aware of the challenges a military confrontation would pose for mobilization. Further, the regime's suppression of independent trade union activity, strikes, and other forms of collective action had not eradicated labor conflicts. Evidence is patchy, but whereas about 168,000 workers had come out on strike in 1923, the security police registered some 65,000 in 1929, and during the first 11 months of 1934, some 8,707 strikers were registered. See Murphy, 2008. As has been argued recently by Kazins and Sakharov, 2006, slowdowns under such conditions were substituted for strikes and thus, quote, became one of the most widely used forms of workers' collective protests. Such slowdowns, quote, Italian strikes, end quote, usually follow the promotion of new economic tasks at the enterprise section. In the light of such passive protests, production operations were not completed, as workers at the sections cut off a few or more hours of work. End quote. Sorry, I was looking to see if there's anything for this Kazantsev and Sakharov, 2006, but I'm not seeing anything. Must be in a foreign language or something. Thus, when more established forms of collective negotiation disappeared, withdrawal of effort as a means to exert influence at the shop floor level became relatively more important. See Lewin, Tackleberg, and Siegler. Lewin, 1981, Tackleberg, 1978, and Siegler, 1983. The two edicts on absenteeism of 1932 and 1938 can be regarded as the regime's initial and flouted response to also suppress these substitutes for strike activity. However, even though the historical background explains why authorities demanded further coercive measures, this alone cannot fully explain exactly why the Edict of the 26th of June 1940 assumed the form it eventually did. New section. Absenteeism and labor turnover were costly for the regime. A third factor emphasized in the literature is the cost that absenteeism and job changing were believed to impose on the economy. It has been argued that turnover rates and low discipline were considered high to a point of disruption in the 1930s. See Barber, 1986. This assumption is not far-fetched. In Western market economies, as in the USSR during the interwar period, labor turnover and absenteeism were major concerns among economists and policymakers. Prickett, 1931, described labor turnover in the U.S. as a, quote, vast political problem, end quote, and, quote, a malady, end quote, and similar opinions were voiced regarding absenteeism. Just a funny story from myself. It was said that my great-great-grandfather missed like 30 days one time, 30 Mondays in a year because he would get drunk on the weekends and then just kind of have his informal Saint Monday. He wouldn't think of it in that, probably wouldn't think of it in those terms, but that was what he was doing. And I can't imagine anyone that I know who had like having a job where they could just miss the first day of the week at their will and still have that job. And this would have been in the interwar period. Well, actually, maybe a little later, actually. It'd probably be during the war. Where am I? Where am I? Archival data on Soviet conditions are contradictory, however, and it is clear that if the Stalinist leadership took these aspects into consideration, it was not on the strength of the official statistics. According to information from the Central Statistical Administration, for 1939, work time lost due to stoppages and sickness was significantly larger than losses due to absenteeism, as was in fact true during the whole Soviet era. Footnote. They're just... no footnote. As was shown in Kragh, 2009, official estimates of losses of labor time were chronically poor. Labor turnover had increased somewhat in the years after the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938, but the general trend was nevertheless a decline. Therefore, if these factors were important, it was because the more significant sources of efficiency losses could not be easily contained. The shortages, which were such an important factor behind stoppages in production, were a structural feature. Sickness was the outcome of aspects such as hazardous work conditions and deficient nutrition. See Osakina, 1998. Already harsh working and living conditions before the war became worse in 1941 after the German attack. All the three explanations above have merit, but they cannot provide an economic rationale for why the leadership targeted absenteeism and labor turnover specifically and in tandem. An economic approach suggests that these two factors imposed cost on the regime in the form of dissipation of rent. See Viniski, 1988. That is, by withdrawing effort through options such as absenteeism and labor turnover, part of the surplus product could be reallocated to the workers from the regime in the form of increased leisure. The options to dissipate rent are what Stalin attempted to contain. By suppressing job changing, Stalin reduced the welfare of the workers by removing their alternative options, which in economic terms translates into a lower equilibrium level of effort. This explains the parallel suppression of absenteeism, which made such acts of non-compliance costly for the workers. In this sense, absenteeism and job changing were related, and thus complementary from the regime's point of view. By suppressing both, Stalin ensured more compliance at the original equilibrium level of effort or higher, but with a lower level of welfare for the workers. This explanation is congruent with Davies' 1997 finding in her study of popular opinion under under Stalin, that the labor edicts were met with little enthusiasm among citizens. According to Wikipedia, Sarah Davies is a historian specializing in the Soviet Union during the Stalin era. Sarah Davies is professor of history at Durham University in Durham, England, United Kingdom, and currently serves as chair of the history department. Sarah Davies received the Alec Nova Prize for her first book, Popular Opinion in Stalin's Russia, which was translated into Russian in 2011. Along with James Harris, Sarah Davies is the author of the 2015 Stalin's World, Dictating the Soviet Order. Funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the book draws on Stalin's personal archives and previously unstudied diaries of people close to him to explain how he understood the world. The authors argue that Stalin was not a paranoid driven by irrational fears. Instead, Stalin's beliefs were shaped by misperceptions stemming in part from flawed intelligence. Davies is currently working on a book on British and Soviet cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. Back to the text. In fact, our explanation predicts why this should be expected. In other words, Stalin ensured that people not only remained at the enterprise, but also that they worked sufficiently hard. The new edict thus covered a loophole which previous legislation had failed to foresee. Lastly, under conditions where the excess demand for labor by enterprises under soft budget constraints, see Kornine 1980, was difficult to regulate, it was less costly to suppress the supply side of the labor equation. When labor is scarce, the value of effort increases, which encourages coercion. Good morning. Figure 1 shows data on sentences for absenteeism and illegal job changing for the period 1940 to 1956. It complements the previously known figures provided by Zemskov, 1990, with archival data also on the last 3 years of the period. In 1940 alone, over 1 million workers were convicted of illegal job changing and absenteeism. As long as Stalin was alive, hundreds of thousands were taken to court on a yearly basis. The by far most common crime in the USSR in the years 1940 to 1956 was absenteeism from work, and in distant second was illegal job changing. The relative share of these crimes to all sentences is illustrated in Figure 2 below, left vertical axis, together with total data on sentences for all crimes in the same period, right vertical axis. The figure illustrates the extent to which these acts were mass crimes, hovering at 61.5% of all convictions in 1940, and then steadily declining through the edict's roughly 15 years of existence. Even though the relative share of convictions under the labor edict decreased by almost 20 percentage units over time, absenteeism and labor turnover were still the single most common, quote, crimes, end quote, in the country, with absenteeism by far the most significant of the two. Figure 2 reveals the importance of the labor edict of Soviet jurisprudence in relative and absolute terms. As the amount of prosecutions on absenteeism and job changing decreased in relative terms in relation to other edicts, so did the amount of prosecutions in total. The two lines are neatly correlated for significant periods of time. And there's a chart here which I'm not going to try to explain, but the author's Kragh is explaining it now. The two lines are neatly correlated for significant periods of time. Except for a few years. The most significant divergence should be noted for the post-war period, when two new edicts on, quote, theft of socialist property, end quote, were promulgated and thus increased the absolute number of convictions. Data on total convictions are also illustrative examples of the repression machinery under Stalin. It's been previously shown, Solomon 1996, Statiev 2010, how superiors were encouraged to show utmost zeal in the early stages of a legal campaign. Under such conditions, enforcement peaked in the short term and then declined over time. There is, however, a second plausible explanation, which relates the use of coercion to the principle's perceived balance of external and internal challenges. Under such conditions, one can expect coercion to increase and then decline as the threat abated, in this case the threat of war. If this hypothesis holds, it implies that Stalin's use of coercion was more predictable than his use of repression, where the timing of the Great Terror still remains a source of controversy among historians. See Davies 2006. This suggestion is elaborated further below. In conclusion, the three previous explanations for the labor edict of the 26th of June 1940 all have merit, although none of them can fully explain why the edict assumed its specific form. Stalin criminalized both absenteeism and turnover since, from the workers' point of view, the two options were substitutes and allowed rent dissipation. With the new legislation, Stalin ensured more compliance at the original level of effort, or higher, but with a lower level of welfare for the workers. As long as the edicts were on the statutes, they were responsible for a dominant share of all convictions, where absenteeism in turn was by far the most common crime. In the next section, it is shown how the labor legislation further evolved during the war, with special emphasis on the edict on desertion from war industry. New section, Labor Coercion at Labor Coercion's Peak, the Edict of 26 December 1941. While the general Soviet mobilization plans of the 1930s have been rather well researched in recent years, see Ken 2002, Melia 2004, Davies and Harrison 1997, Samuelson 2000, Lieberman 1983, attempts by authorities to regulate labor on the home front during the war have remained virtually unexplored. Articles on labor during the war have focused exclusively on the Gulag camps, a narrow focus considering the relatively small share of forced labor to the mobilization effort. See Kotkin 2000 and Barnes 2000. Of special interest in this section is the Edict of the 26th of December 1941, which equates unauthorized absence from war industry with desertion, punishable by up to 8 years in a labor camp. The Edict on Desertion it is counterintuitive in the sense that job changing was already a crime. However, as Solomon has shown, the authorities remained dissatisfied with the outcome, considering the existing legislation to be an insufficient deterrent. Footnote: two complementary edicts also increased levels of coercion against absenteeism. The Edict of the 7th of July 1941 stated that a worker convicted of absenteeism 3 times should be eligible for a prison sentence of between 2 and 4 months, or in other words, they should be convicted in the same way as for willfully leaving their job. On the 12th of November 1942, a third offense of absenteeism was equated with desertion if the last instance of it had been significant, and provided the worker was employed in war industry. End footnote. The fact that war industry was thus subjected to increasing coercion is no coincidence and fits well with the explanation for the edicts elucidated above. The more productive or prioritized the industry, the more can we expect a dictatorship to apply coercive measures. In practical terms, considering that a significant share of industry was on a war footing, most cases of job changing would henceforth be tried in a military tribunal rather than a civilian court. The following section is structured as follows. The first part attempts to concretize, using qualitative and descriptive sources, how the edict on desertion was enforced and what limitations enforcement faced. The second and penultimate part extends this analysis with more aggregate and descriptive quantitative data. The last part concludes. New section, enforcement. It is important to note that coercive legislation seems to have evolved under Stalin in at least two ways. Changes in the level of coercion followed the perceived balance of external and internal challenges. Changes in administrative procedures accrued if authorities believed that enforcement was suboptimal. Interestingly, authorities were continuously amending procedures throughout the entire war and post-war period. Soon after the edict on desertion had been implemented, a new government resolution dated the 3rd of January 1942 instructed directors of all defense industries and their related enterprises to report cases of desertion to a military prosecutor within 1 day after a desertion had been established. In places with no military prosecutor, they were to report to a regional prosecutor. The prosecutor was then to bring the accused to a military tribunal with the relevant evidence. Within 10 days after receiving the case, the stipulated sentence for desertion was between 5 and 8 years in a labor camp. In practice, enforcement of the legislation was heavily affected by conditions of total war. In early March, the People's Commissariat of Justice began reporting to the State Defense Committee, the GKO. The small group of selected leaders under the command of Stalin, which in effect had replaced the Politburo during the war on the handling of the edict on desertion. These reports help us identify the conditions which determine the enforcement of Stalin's labor legislation. One important issue was the difficulties posed by the evacuation of industry from the western regions. Due to organizational problems, it was reported, quote, machinery was standing in the snow, end quote, at the factory property, while some machinery parts had simply not arrived on time or had disappeared. As regards social aspects of labor, quote, the majority of all instances of desertion, end quote, were from, quote, the war industry of the Ural War region, bracket, including, end bracket, such regions as Sverdlovsk, Molotov, and Chelyabinsk, where such a significant share of the evacuated war factories are kept, end quote. Many deserters were young men from the occupied industries. Many deserters were young men from the occupied industry regions of Ukraine who had arrived, quote, by foot and whose clothing and shoes had been worn out. At the new place of work, no preparations for their arrival had been made, end quote. Such conditions explain why managers had low incentives to enforce coercive legislation. When normal work conditions could not be met, they were confronted with a commitment problem. From their point of view, abandoning unbearable conditions was understandable. The result was administrative congestion caused by delays in reporting. An example mentioned in a Party Control Commission, hereafter PCC, report sent to the GKO on the 1st of March 1943 mentions the case of F. Vasilkovsky, a molder convicted twice of absenteeism who on the 21st of August 1942 had abandoned his factory without management's consent and was therefore categorized as a deserter. However, the factory manager had supplied the prosecutor with the necessary information only on the 30th of December, and the military tribunal in turn had received the report from the prosecutors only on the 28th of January 1943. The report underlined that, quote, As a result of this, a malicious violation of the edict took over 5 months to investigate, end quote. A similar case from the same factory was that of F. Ruskik, who had abandoned work on the 13th of August, but whose desertion was not reported until 4 months later. Factory managers, in other words, were not compliant by default, something authorities did not fail to notice. The report noted how about 1,172 persons had reportedly abandoned the strategic factory of Uralmazh Zavod, Sverdlovsk, over a period of 4 months. Out of these, only 448 persons had been sentenced to, quote, deprivation of freedom, end quote. Thus, somewhat more than half of all those who abandoned work willfully were never prosecuted at all. These reports tell us that managers were either under too much strain to report violations or opted for outright leniency, collusion. In any case, the outcome was the same, with workers avoiding actual penalization. On the other hand, the chaotic conditions during the war could also result in managers enforcing the edict on desertion too strictly. In such instances, prosecutors would sometimes reject the case. The PCC report noted that at quote many factories, information on employees and their whereabouts exist in an extremely poor condition, end quote. For these reasons, it was common that, quote, factories supplied the procuracy with completely misleading information so that workers who had in fact been recruited to the Red Army or fallen ill are charged with criminal responsibility, end quote. Sometimes, prosecutors would also dismiss cases considered unjust. The report mentioned the case of a young worker, Dubovica, who had been forced to live at the factory because of shortages of housing and who therefore deserted. Apparently his living conditions were found to have been so poor that the, quote, prosecutor, end quote, rejected his case in excitement, end quote. Many other instances of reported absenteeism can be explained by similar conditions, such as shortages of food, which then had to be found somewhere else, or transport breaking down. Such conditions could put even compliant workers in conflict with the authorities. Archival documents provide a picture of a complex administrative situation. Factory managers were constrained by the conditions of war, resulting in legislation being enforced either too strictly or too leniently. Prosecutors faced similar circumstances. Reports note how they sometimes rejected certain cases, but would accept other unsubstantiated cases at face value, with the result that completely innocent people could be sent to a labor camp. A woman worker in Moscow, M. Kosik, was sentenced to 5 years on the 28th of December. Both the prosecutor and militia had provided the military tribunal with information that she had deserted and had run away. However, she had in fact fallen ill, and that was the reason for her non-appearance at the factory. Another worker at the same factory, A. Orlov, was sentenced to 7 years, when in fact he had simply been transferred temporarily to another section. There was even instances when people who had died were convicted for desertion simply because authorities had failed to investigate properly. Excuse me. I feel like I'm always sick whenever I'm reading these videos, but it's funny listening to them. Like half of them I'm preface like, oh, I have COVID, oh, I have a cold, oh, I have allergies, oh, I have something. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but I don't know. Where am I? Talking about myself. As these examples suggest, agents at different administrative levels faced various incentive structures to comply with legislation which was costly to enforce. It is possible to identify these restraints in at least 4 different dimensions. First, as is also noted by General Prosecutor Viktor Mikhailovich Bukov, factory managers and workers had incentives to collude, something which, quote, seriously threatened to increase the amount of deserters, when the strengthening of labor discipline, end quote, continued to be, quote, one of the most urgent tasks, end quote. To comprehend this logic, it needs to be remembered that factories need as many workers as possible so as to maintain production, and managers therefore had incentives to collude with workers quite regardless of their background. Secondly, there was the difficulty of actually locating the accused deserters, a factor which created large backlogs of cases and administrative congestion. Thirdly, it was noted how militia employees falsified reports when suspects could not be found, or how they allowed suspects to remain in hiding. Either way, the information suggests that search costs for all agents involved in enforcement was too large. That is, efficient enforcement was not necessarily contingent on compliance or non-compliance of Stalin's agents. Even the most loyal agent could find himself confronted with formidable hindrances to enforce the edict on desertion. As long as the external threat of war persisted, the Soviet authorities therefore adapted legislative practices in order to simplify procedures. Firstly, the NKVD issued order number, that's a very big number, so I'm not reading it, dated 28th of October 1942, instructing organs of the militia, in case the accused could not be found, to transfer within 5 days all cases on desertion back to the procurator's office for further direction to an NKVD military tribunal, which then would revise the case, with or without the accused being present. This last aspect was decisive. In fact, the majority of all cases of desertion during the war came to be administered by the tribunals with the accused in absentia. Secondly, on the 14th of March 1943, a further decree also stipulated that responsibility for searches should be transferred from the militia to the NKVD. That is, authorities simplified procedures but also shifted responsibility for enforcement to agents considered more loyal. However, as was soon discovered, most workers who were convicted in absentia were never caught and thus evaded actual punishment. New section. Outcome of the Edict on Desertion. As described in the previous sections, Stalin's coercive apparatus evolved in different trajectories. In the first step, legislation was streamlined in order to ensure compliance and reduce rent dissipation, culminating with the Edict on Desertion on the 26th of December 1941. In the second step, legislative practices had to be improved in order to ensure efficient enforcement. It may be asked, therefore, how many sentences were actually passed for desertion. Unfortunately, detailed data for the whole war period have not been found, but NKVD archival sources provide some interesting insights. They show that sentences for desertion were by no means negligible, and further suggest that the Soviet legal system seemed to emulate the well-known feature of Soviet industry of, quote, storming, end quote. At the beginning of the year, prosecutions were low and the system was systematically filled up by unresolved cases. More than half of all convicted workers in 1942 received their sentences in the last quarter of the year. A majority of those were in turn sentenced in absentia and thus remained de facto unpunished. It illustrates how congestion became an integral aspect of the legal process. A summary of the evolution of sentences by the different courts is provided in Table 2. It was earlier noted how the special edicts of April and May 1943 had made desertion from rail and water transport punishable by sentences of between 3 and 10 years. Such convictions, though negligible in context, were, however, possible already on the basis of the original edict of the 26th of December 1941, contrary to what was previously thought. The level of administrative congestion can be illustrated also with data on cases that were received but remained unprocessed. Such evidence exists for the Ural region, the key hub of the Soviet home front. The data suggests that prosecutors and tribunals were able and willing to process only a minor share of their total caseload. Out of 53,240 cases received in 1942, only 35,120, 65.9%, had been processed, and out of those, some 22,104, 62.9% of the accused were not present when prosecuted. The inefficiency also seems to have been spread out in a relatively even fashion across the 4 quarters of the year, even though the total caseload increased significantly in the last 2 quarters of the year. A sample survey of all those convicted in 1942 also illustrates some general characteristics of the average deserter. In a survey of 35,758 cases, there were 27,275 men, 76.3%, and 8,483 women, 23.7%. 10,942 persons were under 18 years of age, 30.6%, and 14,089 were between 18 and 25 years of age, 39.4%. Only a fraction of those convicted were party members or candidate members, 3.6%, whereas 3,959 had been previously convicted, 11.1%, typically for a previous labor disciplinary infraction. That is, the average deserter was not surprisingly male, young. That is, the average deserter was not surprisingly male, young, and with little work experience, perhaps conscripted from the countryside, which suggests that coercion was more easily applied against relatively unskilled labor. However, this group was probably more flexible and unfettered, making it easier for them also to evade possible punishment. Just as a side note, I believe when you're talking about a lot of like the draconian policies that were enacted during the development of capitalism in England, when people were released from the land, most of the people that were persecuted or hunted or like were unable to acquire like benefits from like the poor law, for instance, were young men and less so young women. So this is similar to what primitive accumulation was like. This is similar to the instance of primitive accumulation in England. Anyway, back to the text. As regards the large share of in absentia sentences, statistics from the NKVD provide information on the share of those convicted in absentia who are located by authorities. The data illustrate that the majority of those convicted was in fact never found. According to the NKVD, tribunals in major industrial hubs like the Urals and Volga regions were unable to locate more than 5% of all those convicted in absentia during 1942. That is, deserters who remained in hiding could be close to confident they would remain unpunished. Sometimes, as archival documents testify, workers did not even try hard to evade punishment, as they remained in the same town or even at the same factory after receiving a verdict, although perhaps they were unaware there was a verdict. As long as the war situation remained, the regime attempted to circumvent non-compliance and their weak monitoring capabilities with a series of amendments to the original edict. Another response to this principal-agent dilemma was also to subject agents responsible for enforcement to additional coercive measures. A government resolution signed by Molotov in March 1943 stipulated that managers were to be held legally responsible for not providing accurate information to authorities or for holding, quote, criminally bureaucratic relations towards living conditions for workers and clerks, end quote. Factory managers were sentenced up to 3 years in prison for neglect of newly arriving workers, production, or evacuated machinery, though such instances seem to have been rare. A few were also sentenced for protecting absentees and deserters. For example, Gorbunov, head of the aluminum factory in Kemerovo Oblast, was sentenced to 10 years for having falsified over 100 cases of desertion following the first years of the war. Police officers were also occasionally convicted of, quote, criminally negligent attitudes toward the search for deserters, end quote, typically by up to 10 years in prison, as refractory timekeepers who inaccurately recorded the presence of employed workers. Unfortunately, the statistical base of these cases is patchy, for which reason no systematic data can be provided. Thus, the quantitative analysis of enforcement of the Edict on Desertion corroborates the more qualitative evidence provided above. The regime implemented simplified procedures and shifted responsibility to more loyal agents, as congestion and non-compliance built up. Further coercive pressure was then applied also on agents, such as militia and factory managers, in order to induce swifter enforcement. However, actual punishment rates in 1942 remained low. New section. The War Period, 1941 to 1945. This section provides longitudinal data on convictions for desertion across the whole war period, illustrating the dynamics of the Soviet legal system at war. It shows how the Edict on Desertion was enforced and the potential reasons for its final relaxation. From an economic point of view, a rational dictator would set an equilibrium level of coercion, which maximizes the amount of deserters punished, with the least amount of administrative congestion. To make a rational choice simply means to choose the most preferred option among different feasible alternatives. This would suggest that Stalin would allow for more simplified procedural methods if there were a signal that enforcement was inefficient or costly. An alternative theory could be that Stalin did not care for the actual punishment rate and that the main target was prophylactic, expecting that draconian legislation would be sufficient deterrent, warranting its costs. Only an empirical analysis can provide any answers. Figure 3 shows it is crucial to understanding of the workings of the Edict on Desertion. It shows yearly data from 1942 to 1946 in 4 steps. First, the number of cases received by the procuracy. Second, the number of instituted proceedings, investigations begun. Third, the number of cases sent to an NKVD military tribunal. And fourth, the number of sentences. The figure illustrates an interesting aspect of the Soviet command structure. All agents except the NKVD military tribunals were to some extent non-compliant, sometimes by default, due to congestion, and sometimes because of organizational resistance. Refusal to prosecute cases considered to be too coercive. The largest discrepancy in the figure is between cases sent to the procuracy, 1,883,028 cases in the period of 1942 to 1945, and the amount of cases actually forwarded to an NKVD military tribunal, 899,749 cases. Not surprisingly, the tribunals were compliant and convicted almost everywhere, regardless of whether the accused was present or not. This is in clear contrast to the Edict of the 26th of June 1940, under which cases were tried in civilian people's courts. As was shown by Solomon in 1996, such courts could opt for leniency if the infraction was deemed just or the punishment considered disproportionate. This can explain why a rational dictator would increase coercion only if he could simultaneously minimize congestion and non-compliance, using more loyal agents such as the NKVD. As the legal system required the participation of a multitude of various agents, enterprise managers, militia, prosecutors, and the NKVD, enforcement would carry with their respective abilities to comply, compared to the number of cases that reached the procuracy from factory managers. Actual convictions were low. The conviction rate, the ratio between cases proceeded by the procuracy to actual convictions in military tribunal, increased from 53.6% to 75.3% between 1942 in 1943, probably because of political pressure and the simplified procedures which had been introduced over time. From then, however, the conviction rate declined to 30% in 1944 and 16.8% in 1945. This was probably the outcome of political relaxation towards the end of the war. It is important to note the large-scale convictions which never resulted in any de facto punishment because the deserters could not be found. Unfortunately, we have not been able to locate any corresponding yearly data on in absentia convictions, although some relevant clues do exist. The share of in absentia convictions was close to 63% in 1942. In the first 2 months of 1944, the corresponding figure was 76.8%. Thus, the higher the ratio of in absentia convictions, the lower was the real punishment rate. As the end of the war approached, it became increasingly less costly to abandon one's work. Not surprisingly, in the last 2 quarters of 1944, out of 201,389 arrested deserters, 52,483 had been sentenced in absentia once before for the same crime. There was also the potential for collusion among workers and factory managers who had a certain degree of discretion as regards reporting. We lack statistics for industry as a whole, but evidence from the important Ministry of Ferrous Metallurgy, Steel and Pig Iron provides some clues. The reported share of unauthorized labor turnover to all employed was 9.7% in 1942 and 11.2% in 1943. The majority of all departures during these years was due to sickness, invalidity, or death. In 1944, unauthorized departures were around 19%, somewhat higher than in previous years, and primarily the result of workers being replaced by returning recruits from the front. In some regions or branches, turnover rates were much higher and sometimes lower. The relevant implication, however, is that the conviction rate seems to be related to the external threat of war rather than the actual levels of unauthorized leaves. Further, managers could also report turnover in a second category, namely, quote, by decision of the administration, end quote. We know that unauthorized departures were often disguised in this category in peacetime, and it is plausible that the practice existed also during the war. The share of departures in this category was around 8% of all employed in 1944, enough to provide managers with discretion to collude with workers. The fact that enforcement was suboptimal does not imply, however, that coercion was insignificant during the war. First of all, the threat was always real, and if we assume that somewhere around 60% of all deserters remained unpunished, this still leaves us with about 307,000 people sent to the Gulag during the war period for abandoning work. If anything, we learn that the Soviet legal system was also arbitrary, since it produced a crime with no obvious criminals or victims. These examples relate to an interesting paradox suggested by Gregory and Harrison. If a totalitarian society cannot function without repression, what should it do when repression no longer works? There were 2 important reforms of the Edict on Desertion by the end of the war, which may provide an answer. Firstly, an option for courts to change indictments on desertion to absenteeism if the worker returned to his original place of work, and secondly, a general amnesty to all those already sentenced in absentia, also upon conditions they returned. This partial liberalization was implemented on the 28th of December, 1944. However, the amnesty covered only those who had been sentenced in absentia and not yet found. It remained silent on those who were already suffering in prison or in a labor camp. That is, the purpose was to release an administrative burden from authorities, not to conclude the campaign against job changing. Now, all workers who compliantly returned to their enterprises would have their indictments changed to absenteeism from desertion or perhaps see the accusations dropped altogether. Further, from 1945 it was also no longer possible to prosecute willful leavers in absentia under the less coercive edict of the 26th of June 1940. The number of cases on desertion sent to the procuracy decreased from 108,194 cases in July 1944 to 31,821 cases in December the same year. Former deserters began to return to their previous site of employment when information on the amnesty spread. An interesting illustration on the outcome of the edict is the fact that out of 205 amnesty deserters who returned to factory number 60 in Frunze, 124 had in fact never left the town, and 72 had remained in the oblast. Not until 31st of May 1948 was the edict abrogated completely, primarily because of the enormous reconstruction effort that remained after the war. See Filter 2002. New section, Conclusions. In conclusion, we can return to our original questions set out in the introduction. How was the legislation enforced, and what were the limits to its enforcement? This article identified 4 restraints on the enforcement of coercive labor legislation under Stalin. First, there was collusion at the enterprise level between managers and workers, and the former were also subject to a commitment problem which reduced coercion. Secondly, increased search costs for the militia could result in enforcement being either too lenient or too abusive, both alternatives being inefficient. Thirdly, there was administrative congestion in the procuracy organs, which reduced efficiency through long delays. Fourthly, enforcement was mitigated because of the low punishment rate associated with the practice of in absentia convictions. An objective assessment of the costs of coercion is not possible due to the difficulties in estimating economic indicators in planned economies. Looking at the available evidence, however, some conclusions about the factors that shaped the dictator's actions may nevertheless be drawn. The regime introduced simplified procedures and shifted responsibility for enforcement to more loyal agents as long as the external threat of war remained. Additional pressure was also imposed on agents considered insufficiently compliant, primarily managers and militia. Nevertheless, actual punishment rates remained low in relation to convictions and existing turnover rates in industry. Our conclusion is that Stalin attempted to find an optimal equilibrium which maximized enforcement with the lowest level of congestion possible, in order to ensure a stable level of effort. This strategy was applied as long as the perceived threat of war persisted, making the conclusion also congruent with Paul Gregory's model of coercion in the short term. An important addition to previous research, we would suggest, is our identification of a relevant principal-agent dilemma that confronted Stalinist coercion. A full understanding of Stalinist coercion is possible only if the dictator's restraints are taken into account. Wintrobe's 1998 model of repression, assuming restraints to be irrelevant, is, in the light of this too general to be useful. Various restraints were not only important for the outcome of coercion/repression, they in fact offer an invaluable key to understanding the dictator's actions. Although the results presented in this article are not generally applicable, and important aspects have also been omitted, such as the regime's use of, quote, carrots, end quote, and not only, quote, sticks, end quote, a potentially fruitful implication for future research on Stalinism could be to look for at least 2 relevant factors: economic and technological factors which limited the dictator's actions, regardless of his agent's level of compliance, and political or judicial factors which put a downward pressure on enforcement, no matter what the dictator did to avoid it. Why did the legislation on labor assume the specific form it did under Stalin? The article suggests an economic rationale for the combined suppression of job changing and absenteeism. Previous research has explained the labor edicts primarily with reference to timing, the war. But previous research has not explained why coercion of labor assumed the form the conversion of labor did. As noted above, by suppressing job changing, Stalin reduced the welfare of the workers by removing the workers' alternative options, making them worse overall. Under these conditions, It was increasingly efficient to suppress absenteeism as well, making it more costly for workers to withdraw effort. Stalin applied coercion broadly, as it was difficult to in practice to know the distribution of the true amount of compliant compared with non-compliant agents. Stalin's actions were restrained, and he could, according to our suggested interpretation, only increase coercion if he simultaneously introduced simplified methods, reducing the economic and technological restraints, or shifted responsibility to more loyal agents, reducing the political and judicial restraints. Evidence suggests that he did both, until the cost of coercion outweighed perceived benefits. Finally, the data on the number of unpunished deserters also had new perspectives on the Soviet labor camps. Most academic discussion has hitherto focused on aspects where the NKVD statistics underestimate the total number of victims of repression. The data on sentences for desertion show that there might equally be instances of overestimating certain figures, or to put it more succinctly, the preceding analysis has shown that wartime data on sentences to labor camps do not necessarily represent reliable figures on the actual flow to the labor camp population. These conclusions do not fundamentally alter any previous perception of the scale of repression, but they do add to a fuller and more complete understanding of how Soviet jurisprudence worked in practice, not least during a situation of total war. That's the end of the piece. I'm going to read the references. D. Akimoglu and A. Wolitsky, 2009, The Economics of Labor Coercion, working paper. J. Barber, article, The Development of Soviet Employment and Labor Policy, 1931 to 41, in Lane's edited volume, Labor and Employment in the USSR. S. Barnes, 2000, article, All for the Front, All for the Victory, the Mobilization of Forced Labor in the Soviet Union during World War II. H. Brenhardt's 1953 article, Absence and Labor Turnover in a Changing Economic Climate. T. Brass and Marcel van der Linden, its edited volume of 1997, Free and Unfree Labor, The Debate Continues. Robert Conquest, 1967, Industrial Workers in the USSR. Robert Conquest article, 1999, Comment on Wheatcroft. R. W. Davies, 2006, article, The Soviet Economy and the Launching of the Great Terror, in M. Illick's edited volume of 2006, Stalin's Terror Revisited. R. W. Davies and Mark Harrison, 1997, article, The Soviet Military Economic Effort under the Second Five-Year Plan, 1933 to 1937. S. Davies, 1997, book, Popular Opinion in Stalin's Russia, Terror, Propaganda, and Dissent, 1934 to 41. S. L. Engerman's book, 1999, Terms of Labor, Slavery, Serfdom, and Free Labor. Donald Filzer, 1986, Soviet Workers and Stalinist Industrialization, The Formation of Modern Soviet Production Relations, 1928 to 1941. Donald Filzer, 2002, book, Soviet Workers and Late Stalinism, Labor and Restoration of the Stalinist System After World War II. Donald Filzer's 2010 book, Labor, quote, Desertion. Oh, no, it's a working paper. Labor, quote, Desertion, end quote, in Soviet Defense During World War II. Sheila Fitzpatrick, 1994, article, Workers Against Bosses, The Impact of the Great Purges on Labor Management Relations, in L. Siegelbaum and G. Suni's 1994 edited volume, Making Workers Soviet, Power, Class, and Identity. E. Gorlitsky, 2001, Theft Under Stalin, A Property Rights Analysis, working paper. Paul Gregory, 2004, The Political Economy of Stalinism, Evidence from the Soviet Secret Archives. Paul Gregory and Mark Harrison's article, Allocation Under Dictatorship in Stalin's Archives. Paul Gregory's book, Terror by Quota, State Security from Lenin to Stalin. G. Hardak, 1973, Der Erste Weltkrieg, Mark Harrison's article of 2002, Coercion, Compliance, and the Collapse of the Soviet Command Economy. Something in Russian by Kazintsev and Sakharov. Something in Russian by O. Ken. G. Kessler, 2001, The Passport System and State Control article. G. Kessler, 2001 article, The Passport System and State Control over Population Flows in the Soviet Union, 1932 to 41. J. Kornai, 1980, Economics of Shortage. Stephen, I think it is, Kotkin, 2000, World War II and Labor, a Lost Cause article. M. Kragh, 2009, Exit and Voice Dynamics, an Empirical Study of the Soviet Labor Market, 1940 to the 1960s. Martin Kragh, 2011 article, Soviet Labor Law During the Second World War. 1981, Moshe Lewin's article, Social Relations Inside Industry During the Pre-War 5-Year Plans, in Shaul Betleim's book, L'Industrialisation de URSS dans les années 30. S.R. Lieberman, 1983 article, The Evacuation of Industry in the Soviet Union During World War II. Something in Russian by A. Markovich and A. Sokolov. Something in Russian by an M. Merovich. Something in Russian by A. Malia. Something in Russian by Mironenko and Vert and Zuzina. Something in Russian by Mitrofanova. K. Murphy, I think it's Kevin Murphy, 2008, Strikes During the Early Soviet Period, in Donald Filzer and Wendy Goldman's edited volume, A Dream Deferred, New Studies in Russian and Soviet Labor History. Alec Nova, 1992, An Economic History of the USSR, 1917 to 1991, revised edition. Something by an E. Osokina. Something by a G. Polyak. A. L. Prickett, 1931, Labor Turnover Rate and Cost. An article. Annie Rosenfeld, 2009, The quote, Special World, Stalin's Power Apparatus and the Soviet System's Secret Structures of Communication. That's a book. L. Samuelson's 2000 book, Plans for Stalin's War Machine, Tukhachevsky and Military Economic Planning. Solomon Schwartz, 1953, Labor in the Soviet Union. A.K. Sokolov's 2004, something in Russian by A.K. Sokolov. P.H. Solomon, 1996 book, Soviet Criminal Justice Under Stalin. A. Statiev, 2010, Penal Units in the Red Army. W. Tackleberg, 1978 article, Labor Turnover and Job Statification, Indicators of Industrial Conflict in the USSR, ? Something by an A. Volkov from 1974. S.G. Wheatcroft, 2000 article, The Scale and Nature of Stalinist Repression and Its Demographic Significance. Comments by Keep and Conquest. J. Vinisky, 1988, The Distorted World of the Soviet-Type Economies. R. Wintrobe's 1998 book, The Political Economy of Dictatorship. Something by V.N. Zemskov. An article by C. Siegler from 1983 titled Worker Participation and Worker Discontent in the Soviet Union. and something by a V.F. Zima, 1996. Okay, so that is the end of the article. Thank you so much for listening.